Yo, what's going on, guys? It's me, Van Weep here, back with What If Subaru was Sukuna's vessel, aka Curse King Subaru. Today, we're entering into part 13, going even further beyond as we move further into the fourth arc of ReZero, the Everlasting Contract. Let's get into it. Last time, we had ended the episode with Emilia waking up and Subaru having completed the first trial. Subaru could now finally finish the goal he had even been wanting to do, which is actually pull Emilia out of the graveyard to see if she was okay. Now that Subaru had done that, he would hear screaming from outside, as Rem and Ram would both be there with Roswaal injured, standing aside them with a cane. Subaru, helping Emilia up, would walk out of the graveyard. When Subaru exits the graveyard carrying Emilia, he would then see Ram, Roswaal, as well as Ryuzu Mayer and Garfield standing on the side, watching to see how the trial went. And based on what they see of Emilia, it didn't go so well. Garfield, seeing how Subaru had entered into the graveyard and returned carrying Emilia without any injuries, would become suspicious. Because if you didn't remember, the graveyard is a place that only half demis could actually enter. Demis just referring to demi-humans, like mixed animals or mixed between two races, like Emilia being a half-elf, since she's half human and half elf, obviously. And unlike the original ReZero, where Subaru was just purely a human and shouldn't have been able to enter, Subaru here actually does have a fairly good reason why he could enter the graveyard and legitimately take the contracts without having to have Echidna give him express permission. You see, this Subaru is already almost completely mixed with the fingers that Sukuna has consumed within inside Subaru's body. And Sukuna isn't a human. Since Sukuna is purely a cursed spirit, Subaru absorbing a cursed spirit makes him a cursed spirit-human hybrid at this point, since he's neither just a human or a fully converted Sukuna without Sukuna's fingers all being consumed. So at this point, Subaru is technically not purely just a human, which gives him the right to actually take the trials. You see, it's actually here where a character that I have heavily underutilized in my other ReZero series, that being What If Naruto was in ReZero, comes into play. That being Otto, who's been coming along with the ride this entire time and simply just hasn't really done anything, so I haven't had to mention him. But best boy Otto's here. He would ask Subaru how he came out of the trial unscathed, with Subaru trying to think of a good response. In this version, both Rem and Ram are standing beside Emilia, since Crush was the one who had her memories taken when the two witch archbishops had attacked. It's at this point where Garfield and Ryuzu Mayer would interrupt, explaining that it doesn't matter because Emilia is the one who has to take the trials. You see, Subaru in this timeline has blasted through everything in his path, following the path of the strong. So you see, just like the original Subaru in canon, he saw no real issue with him being the one to take the trials instead, since Subaru himself, if he was able to take them without any issue, then why shouldn't he be the one to pass the trial? This is where, when Ryuzu and Garfield explain that Roswaal needs Emilia to take the trial, Emilia would feel several emotions stirring within her, thinking about how if she can't even face her own past, how can she become the leader of a country, to be able to lead Lagunica? This is where she hardens her resolve to take the trials. It's at this point where Subaru's ideals would be come into question within his own mind. Subaru wondering if his method was really what's best for Emilia. Thinking about it, he decided to say nothing, basically approving Emilia to continue to take the trials. Emilia would fall unconscious from all the exhaustion of the trial and would be put in her room to rest. Subaru walking outside would talk with Ryuzu, Garfield, and Ram asking why Subaru is being so defensive. Subaru having taken up the role of Puck after Puck had simply disappeared now that they were in the sanctuary, for some reason just not choosing to show up for Emilia even when she calls her summon. Subaru would think in his mind, gee, it sure would be convenient if Sukuna disappeared like Puck did. Sukuna making a grumpy sound. It's after Subaru's talk with Ram, Ryuzu, and Garfield that Otto would have appeared to have been eavesdropping, talking with Subaru. But Subaru wouldn't be mad at Otto for spying on them. Instead, Subaru would ask Otto what his opinion was on the current events unfolding. Being an outsider from the Emilia camp, he would question what Otto's thoughts were, with him obviously siding with Garfield and Ryuzu, who would be supporting Roswaal. I mean, after all, Roswaal is the leader of this land and the lord of its domain, so it makes sense for him not to want to be on his bad side. Not to mention that if Emilia herself wasn't the one to actually pass the trials, the amount of prestige and record that comes with doing that would not really be taken for her. Wondering if Subaru was the one to complete the trials, how truly effective that would be in boosting Emilia's prestige around the kingdom. Ram would ask Subaru if it's actually possible for Emilia to complete the trial, with Subaru thinking about it, saying that it's not that he doesn't think it's possible, it's just that it's probably going to take her an incredibly long time. And surprisingly, Ram would agree with Subaru, saying that it would be ideal if Emilia could finish the trials before the next 3 years, coming towards the end of the royal selection. She would say this with such a serious expression on her face that Subaru would realize that it may actually take that long. This would cause Subaru some unrest, thinking that they need to try and figure out how they can finish this up faster. This is where Otto would again chime in, saying that it would be best if Emilia could finish this up as soon as possible, going over the situation with the Arlem villagers that were being currently held captive by the Sanctuary. The Sanctuary not releasing them until Emilia is the one to finish the trials and free the Sanctuary. Shortly after, this conversation would break up, and it was now time for Subaru's appointment of Roswaal. Both Rem and Ram accompanying Subaru into the room with a heavily injured Roswaal who had attempted to enter the graveyard. It's here that Subaru would explain all of his exploits to Roswaal, including taking down the White Whale and the attack on the mansion by the Witch Archbishop of Sloth. It's here that Roswaal would ask a very interesting question, wondering what happened with the White Whale and Wilhelm. Wilhelm being the husband of the last Astrea to be the Sword Saint. Subaru would calmly answer that he was actually the one to help him slay the whale, and this is where something very interesting happens. Roswaal would have a conflicted tone and expression, appearing to be happy for Wilhelm, explaining that he was familiar with one of his ancestors, Wilhelm and Roswaal's ancestor having been acquainted, and yet Roswaal also had a look of discomfort now knowing this new information Subaru had presented. It was definitely something Subaru and Sukuna were both taking note of. It's after this that instead of Rem and Subaru would be the ones to go on Patrash, heading back to the mansion. It'd be here where Rem and Subaru would actually meet up with Petra, who would just ask about the day-to-day life of the sanctuary before Subaru and Rem would head into the mansion. It's here where Subaru would meet with Frederica, Rem at his side, and Petra in the mansion. As Subaru would enter into the meeting room to discuss with Frederica about the sanctuary, this is when Elsa and the mob beast would attack. Subaru is currently on his first loop actually here in the mansion, so he had no idea this attack was even taking place, having simply gone back to retrieve Frederica to ask her on any advice on what she could give him on how to clear the sanctuary. It's here at this point where a familiar face returns. Elsa. Elsa Granhirt the Bowel Hunter, holding Petra by the throat with her blade against her neck. Rem would use ice magic, setting an icicle flying towards Elsa's head. Immediately after Elsa dodges this attack, Frederica would come in on the attack, striking at Elsa, who would block her claws. Subaru would then burst onto the scene using immense speed from his foot, using a quick first step as he grabs Petra and pushes out behind the door, now in the hallway, a few meters away from Elsa. Subaru would think this would be easy, just a 3-on-1, saying he could almost take her last time. It's here when Subaru would sense something as he throws Petra into a room and slams the door shut. The Guilty Low, the monster inside the mansion, would appear. Elsa would smile, saying she'll take out the rest of the people in the mansion if Melee can handle that one. Subaru would turn around, powering up cursed energy into his fists as he lands a black flash uppercutting the giant lion-like maw beast. Black Flash! This uppercut would not be nearly enough, as the Guilty Loaf falls back to the ground and roars flames towards Subaru. Subaru could barely hold up his arms to block the blasts, burns covering his arms and scarring them, as Subaru would basically have to bite his tongue to stop screaming. Subaru would turn to find Ram and Frederica fighting off Elsa, but barely able to keep up. Subaru was now wondering if there was any way for him to solve both problems with his current amount of cursed energy. I mean, he did have one of Sukuna's rare curse techniques completely absorbed into his body, that of course being Cleave, a slashing attack that can adjust itself depending on the target's toughness curse energy level to cut them completely in one ability. However, for Subaru it takes a lot of curse energy to use. Aside from that, Subaru also has access to using a incredibly basic prototype of Sukuna's domain expansion, which he's now used twice in the story so far, and has drained him immensely both times. Subaru grit his teeth, realizing that there's only one way out of this, using Cleave on the guilty low, this severing one of its arms as it falls, now unbalanced. Subaru would turn around, having about half of his cursed energy left, as he runs towards Elsa, covering his right fist with cursed energy. Subaru would throw a right punch, which Elsa would easily block for her hand. This would, however, get hit then by cursed energy, sending her propulsed back, which would give Rem an advantage as she throws another mace shot towards her. Elsa would rebound off the wall using her immense speed as she bounces off of the walls towards Subaru. Subaru would then power up more cursed energy, now trying to create a guard as he holds his fists up ready for the slash. Frederica would come in using her claws as she strikes Elsa, who would crash into the door of the next room. Subaru, looking down the hallway, would realize that all the doors were open as Subaru thinks about what this could mean, realizing that Beatrice was still in the mansion. Subaru would run down the hallway, telling Ren and Frederica to get out of Petra as he looks through room to room, eventually finding the room with the great library open and burning, since the mansion had already been set aflame by the guilty loan before Subaru had recognized that fact. As Subaru enters the Great Library, he would see Beatrice laying there slowly deteriorating, having been stabbed by Elsa. And here is where Subaru would realize he was too late. Flames enveloping Arlem Village, flames enveloping the mansion, Subaru falling to despair as Rem, Frederica, and Subaru, and Petra would all die. Subaru burning in the flames of the mansion, as he would return by death. Subaru opening his eyes, now realizing that he's outside the graveyard and back inside of the sanctuary. You see, something that is interesting about Return by Death is that, for Subaru, his perspective of him dying and waking up back in the next run isn't so much waking up so much as a consistent stream of consciousness. Think of it as if though you were suddenly bombarded with new senses and thousands of new stimulants all at once. Your brain having just felt you dying as you watched your consciousness fade away, knowing that you were dying, and then just suddenly being somewhere else. That's how Return by Death works, at least in the light novel. There's no portal or sleep-like trance or loop. He just directly switches consciousnesses almost instantly. And it's a feeling that Subaru himself could never get used to, that eerie feeling. Subaru would grab himself by the knee, pulling himself up to his feet, as he walks and then runs into the graveyard to find Emilia laying on the floor shaking, her eyes filled with tears, having seen something that Subaru couldn't possibly imagine. Subaru would help hoist Emilia up, carrying her, as he goes outside to find Ram, Roswaal in his bandages, and of course Ryuzu Mayer and Garfield. Subaru's scent of the witch would have increased by now again, since Subaru in this timeline hasn't used Return by Death nearly as much as the original Subaru, so of course Ram and Rem can sense this, now wondering what happened to Subaru. Subaru would immediately take Emilia back to Roswaal's establishment, where Roswaal would be staying due to his injuries, and he would then have a discussion with Ram and Rem, asking them what they think might be going on with the rest of the Arlem villagers back at the main mansion estate. This would seemingly be a throwaway question that would cause the two sisters to be confused. Rem would touch Subaru's arm, asking what he's asking, with her saying that Emilia is currently the one with the most stress on her plate right now. Subaru would nod, putting on a face saying he understands that, but he's saying that if Emilia is worrying about both halves of the village, then that guilt and worry might even grow to become even more of a burden on her during the trials. Subaru, Ram, and Rem would debate this for a while, with Subaru obviously having a goal he's trying to get to the point of, being that he wants to bring both Ram and Rem back with him to the mansion, thinking that if he can convince Ram and Rem to leave him as soon as possible back to the mansion, then it's possible that with Frederica and their four all working together, they can drive out Elsa, as well as take care of Miley and the other maw beasts that Subaru had suspected were brought by her into the village. The idea of a demon beast tamer and an assassin of Elsa's high quality working together was a bone-chilling idea. However, Ryuzu and Garfield would step in, Garfield looking even more suspicious of Subaru this time around, with Garfield able to smell his scent of the witch, saying that Subaru and the girls should put this conversation on hold until Emilia wakes up, saying that they need to have this discussion with Roswaal. Interesting enough, however, one thing that had changed was a seemingly prior constant, that being Roswaal. Subaru, this time as he enters into the room for his meeting with Roswaal, would have a completely different conversation, which even with Subaru and Sukuna's minor knowledge of return by death, should not be happening. It's almost as if Roswaal knows about some of the events that had taken place and was now reacting to what had happened in a prior run. The main lead of this, strangely enough, being him not even asking what Subaru had done for his exploits in the capital, or asking about Wilhelm at all. This particularly would throw off Subaru, and Sukuna would be thinking about how this is interesting in his head as well, wondering about this tricky old clown guy. Something Sukuna can sense that Subaru can't is the age of Roswaal's soul, his soul being older than the body he's currently in. Sukuna would laugh, thinking to himself how this is getting interesting. This thought of his only being further confirmed once everyone had left the room, and Roswaal would ask Subaru to stay behind. Subaru and Roswaal having a long chat, as Roswaal would ask Subaru about the mansion, saying he had overheard his conversation with Rem and Ram. Roswaal smirking, saying he gives his blessing to them to go back to the mansion and make sure the rest of the populace knows of the situation. Subaru would thank Roswaal, saying he's going to go check on Emilia since Puck hasn't showed up yet. Subaru walking away as Sukuna and Roswaal would be thinking about what's going on the battlefield, the transparent battlefield. Subaru would walk into Emilia's room, seeing her sitting up in her bed, as Subaru would knock on the side of the door frame asking how she's doing. Subaru and Emilia would have a long talk, discussing wondering where Puck could be, and any plans on how they can free the sanctuary. Subaru would wish Emilia a good night as he walks out the door, Emilia feeling oddly jealous of Rem for some reason. She'd ignore it, turning over on her pillow thinking about what she had seen, trying to sleep and having that same nightmare over and over again, reaching out for someone to take her hand. As Subaru would go into his own room laying down, a few minutes later he'd feel something sneaking in behind him, as behind him he'd feel small hands wrapping around him from his back, as we hear Rem whisper in Subaru's ear that he's been ignoring her. Subaru would have a huge grin on his face in the dark, turning back as Ram would then turn over, giving him a kiss on the cheek, her being able to see in the dark. Subaru would turn, embracing Rem, as Ram would close the door behind, having seen it was still slightly ajar. Having clearly a red blush on her face, she walks away. Subaru thinking in his mind that he wants to protect you, looking at Rem as he touches her face. Sukuna at this point would basically be watching, egging him on. Our view fading off into the night as we prepare for the rest of the events going on in Arc 4 of ReZero. Getting into next time with part 14 of What If Subaru Was Sukuna's Vessel. I'll see you guys then. Bye.